I'll pass the microphone on to Adi Ophir, who will be chairing the second panel.
So we have 4 speakers in this panel. I suggest that we start with 3 and then give the opportunity to Bashar to sum up and be the last speaker, I think, after the discussion.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So our 3 speakers, and this is the order of their presentations. Tamara Chin from the Comparative Literature Department. As before, we are very brief on presentation, so forgive me. I'm not?
You
Am
are
I not?
no.
Sorry. Vikram Thakur, postdoctorate fellow at with the Mellon Sawyer seminar project. And Rebecca Nedostap from the History Department. First, Tamara on contact, and then Vikram on resettlement, and Rebecca on emplacement.
This paper offers a responsive sort to the question, what is modern about modern displacement? By differentiating 2 approaches to pre-modern displacement. The first approach looks to demography, juxtaposing ancient and modern scales of displacement. For students of the ancient world, statistics on migration most commonly appear as part of the history of contact. Longue durée histories of intercultural and transregional contact encompass consonant themes that make ancient modern demographic comparison coherent. Warfare, slavery, colonialism, cultural entanglement, economic migration, ecological crisis, nomadism, and so forth. The second approach begins with the effective life of displacement, rethinking its headcount and narrativity from the perspective of lyric poetry. 1. Demography. Sheer scale is often invoked to characterize the modernity of 20th and 21st century migrations. The statistics are indeed unprecedented. 65.3 million, or 1% of the global population, forcibly displaced in 2015. In China, 15 million displaced by the Three Gorges Dam. 220 million, largely rural to urban migrant workers, spend most of the year away from home, and 2 to 3 billion journeys made during Chinese Lunar New Year in what is dubbed the world's largest annual human migration. Nothing in antiquity can compare to these figures. And yet, in proportional terms, historical demography yields some remarkably modern numbers. China is a useful case, not so much for its reliably massive population, as for its unusual history of record keeping. The world's earliest countrywide population censuses began in Han Dynasty China. The first, in 2 CE, recorded 12 million households and 60 million people, and historical demographers have since used forced migration due to conflict to explain some of China's most dramatic population changes. One of the earliest came with the 3rd century collapse of unified empire during China's period of disunion, 3rd to 6th century, when 10 million people from Central Asia migrated to northern China, and forcing about 10% of China's total population to permanently flee south. As relative proportions rather than numerical quantities, these displacements rival modern-day figures. Crucially, China's imperial censuses took the conjugal household as its basic unit for taxation, corvée, and administration. This was ostensibly a demographic unit of settlement, but as with modern censuses, it could retrospectively be used to reveal transregional and external migration and settlement. In the colonial settlement of Han Dynasty frontiers, it was advised, quote, county officials should buy husbands or wives for migrants because by nature people cannot settle peacefully for long without a mate, unquote. The much debated reliability of China's regular census seems to have depended on how settled the empire was. For example, China's recorded population appears to have halved at times, and historical demographers have explained that this was as much due to the bureaucratic difficulties in completing the census during unstable times as it was to the wars and migrations causing instability. The household thus became a measure of settlement both as the basic demographic unit of the census and in its felicitous documentation by the census taker as an index of a settled, well-administered era. 2. Lyric. Turning from the demographic object to the lyric subject, two gendered discourses of dislocation emerge. One centered on political exile, and another that conventionalized the wife's experience of marriage as forcible dislocation, as something correlative to political exile. Both traditions shared a lexicon and lyric grammar of displacement. Indeed, China's tradition of women's writing properly begins with displacement. Quote, "My family married me out to the other side of heaven. I wish I were a golden swan returning to its old homestead," unquote, lamented Liu Xijun, a Han Dynasty princess sent to marry a Central Asian leader with whom she has, quote, "no verbal communication," unquote. In Cai Yan's 3rd century 18 Songs of a Nomad Flute, a poem that influenced generations of writers, artists, and Marxist revolutionaries, quote, "A barbarian of the northwest tribes took me to wife by force. What we like and what we want are not the same. With whom can I even speak?" Unquote. These frontier poems that helped to introduce women's lyric into the Chinese tradition fused marital and geographical dislocation, setting the lyric subject's identification with the Chinese language in opposition to the foreign speaker. At the same time, the bride's normative experience of arranged marriage within China itself became poetically naturalized as displacement. The Rhapsody on Thoughts on Separation by the 3rd century imperial concubine Zuo Fen is an early example. Quote, "Like Antares and Orion, long have my family and I been parted. It's not that the distance is far, it does not even exceed several measures, but how cold and confining is the forbidden palace. The official Qu was beset by sorrow. Oh, how he grieved at separation, but how much more painful for parents and children who love each other, cut off so long and so far," unquote. Zuo Fen here borrows a male poetics of exile in two ways. First, she explicitly compares her dislocation to that of China's archetype of geopolitical exile, namely Qu, an ancient official who was banished by his ruler. And second, her poem borrows the 6 and 7 syllable sao or lyric meter that Qu poetry pioneered. Lamenting in this canonical rhythm of displacement, the bride joins the exile on the same calibrated scale of dispossession. She says, how much more painful for parents and children. Zuo Fen's marriage protest ostensibly challenges the canonical Confucian bond of husband and wife. Before her, the official Qu had likened political exile to being spurned by a lover or spouse, using a well-known correlation in Chinese poetry and historiography between the breakage of the primary Confucian bond of subject and ruler with the breakage of the husband-wife bond. Zuo Fen's poem, however, correlates felicitous marriage with political dysfunction, essentially trumping the husband-wife relation with the third Confucian bond of parent and child. This representation of marriage as natal dislocation circulated for 2 millennia in poetry as well as in canonical prose works like Ban Zhao's Precepts for My Daughters that lay at the core of women's education across East Asia. The lyric persona of the dislocated wife resisted but never displaced China's dominant poetics of marriage centered on love, male love for the ideal wife. Except in the context of intercultural marriage, this lament therefore occupied no coherent place in the historiography of contact. So to summarize, demography counted the conjugal household as the necessary unit of settlement and resettlement. Poetry remade that household a constitutive practice and site of permanent dislocation, or as I think Bishara was put it, forced placement. The lyric I broke down the household into inexchangeable units, even as it enlarged the universal symbolic repertoire of displacement. The conjugal home, the sanctioned site of contact between the sexes, thus became a place of both settlement and unsettlement. This other history of contact, the count of those who experienced, or at least discursively recognized, marital union as natal dislocation, follows a nonlinear spatiotemporality. Women migrated individually, in disaggregated, syncopated, generationally cyclical dislocations. Potentially vast numbers shared a parallel trajectory from natal to marital home. However, their atomized movements lacked the geographic or demographic legibility of internal or external migration. The lyric eventfulness of marital dislocation thus disappears within demography and historiography as mere kinship ritual and is divorced as such from the political. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My concept is, it's not working, yes. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. My concept is resettlement. The last 2 centuries have witnessed the displacement of millions of people getting involuntarily displaced due to development projects, including industries and dams. During the 1990s itself, between 90 to 100 million people were displaced by development projects. Social science research has, however, focused overwhelmingly on the phenomena of displacement itself and its various aspects, such as victimhood, along with the socio-economic uncertainties it engenders, or resistance against specific projects. The facet of relocation and resettlement itself has drawn little academic attention. This has been the case despite organized resistance by affected groups, increased political cost for the state, and in the last 2 decades, media attention, often supported by local and transnational NGOs and advocacy networks, that have forced governments to offer resettlement packages, including land, to the affected groups. In this position paper, I analyze the process of resettlement by focusing on 2 aspects that are crucial for determining its direction and efficacy. Based on data from over 12 different state irrigation projects in Western India's states of Maharashtra and Gujarat, collected over a 15-year period, I argue that collective action by groups facing displacement is critical for the process of resettlement to be implemented by the state. I further contend that both displacement and resettlement, instead of being a one-off event, are long-drawn intergenerational phenomenon. The first aspect, collective action and bargaining. In the context of development projects implemented in the global south, the affected groups are often from rural areas and usually also belong to marginal sections. Their ability to understand the implications of a given project and the disruption it will cause in their lives is limited due to complex nature of the project itself. States being usually opaque about their plans and sharing details of its human impact usually add to this complication. However, given the long gestation period of projects, often compounded by the slow movement of the state's various arms, the population to be impacted does come to know about the project and its intended impact, often when the venture is well underway. In this setting, the ability of affected groups to mobilize themselves for collective action is the first vital requirement. A relatively tolerant polity based on democratic principles, tolerant in the face of resistance, and repressive but not to the point of completely crushing people's movement, and willing to sit on the negotiation table when faced with sustained popular resistance, offers the space for bargaining. Such polities usually also have prior direct and indirect institutional mechanisms and laws as a source of redress mechanism that may get deployed by the population to be displaced. Wary of an uncertain future, the affected groups usually begin their protest demanding that the project itself be scrapped, while the states try to push it through. It is in this setting that opposition to the project usually intensifies. Mobilization by marginal groups is a form of collective bargaining that allows them to negotiate the terms of their resettlement package centered on land-for-land compensation, along with monetary payments that offer a viable alternative way to recreate their socio-economic life in a new setting. The bargaining is, however, only successful to the point that the leaders of the resistance do not get co-opted to strike favorable bargains on behalf of their families or those near and dear to them. Peripheral groups often lack cultural, linguistic, and educational capital, have to make alliances with external entities such as mainstream political electoral parties, professional activists, advocacy networks, and transnational NGOs. This may result in layering of the mobilization, where each of its varied component tries to pursue its particular agenda. States, even in democratic setting, may offer a generous package, but its effective implementation hinges on the sustained pressure of the mobilization itself. As movements wax and wane, depending on the status of the implementation of the resettlement package, multiple cycles of protest ensue even before a viable resettlement package gets implemented on the ground over several years. The second key aspect is seeing resettlement as an intergenerational phenomenon. Forced relocation of entire communities to an alien setting can be devastating, particularly when it involves distinct ethnic groups being moved amidst alien neighboring clusters. Given the complex multi-ethnic, multilingual composition of groups in most of the old world, which is Asia, Africa, and to a lesser extent even Latin America, along with history of association with a particular place spanning generations, resettlement too has to be viewed through the lens of intergenerational transformation. This is in contrast to settings in North America, where most people's association with a place go back to only 2 or 3 generations in many cases. The skill set that the displaced group possesses also reflects on their attachment to a place and their ability to adjust to a new setting. Groups displaced by displacement projects are often from rural areas or marginal groups, usually comprised of members with little or no education. Agriculture and allied activities is the sole source of their livelihood. They belong to villages or small towns housing their extended kinship groups. These factors imply that decisions regarding willingness to participate in collective action, acceptance or refusal of resettlement package offers, and the move away from their original homes is not an individual decision or one confined to a single family. They are usually decided in a group setting comprised of extended family, kinship, and others who are part of their ethnic fraternity. Forced displacement not only causes serious stress centered around the uncertainties over livelihood, housing, and the weakening of kinship network, it also causes serious intergenerational conflict that persists even after the relocation has taken place. Thus, forced relocation has to be seen as a process requiring at least 3 generations, if not more. Generation 1 comprises of those above the age of 40 who have difficulty getting settled in a new setting, always feel that something is amiss, and yearn for a life of yore. Generation 2 comprises of those in the age group of 20 to 40 who take the initiative to get settled in an alien setting in the midst of a new community where relocation takes place. Compared to their older generation, they try to get assimilated and have lesser nostalgia for their earlier home. If some sort of mobilization, howsoever insignificant, preceded the forced relocation, this generation will be more organized, aggressive, and vocal in airing their grievances and representing their case before the relevant state authorities. Generation 3 will be those younger than age 10 for whom the new setting is the only home they will ever know. This 3-generational transitional format differs when it comes to gender. Given that it is women in rural setting who have to do all the household chores, take care of children, but also participate in livelihood activities such as farming, The struggle and uncertainty can be acute even for Generation 2. Issues of security around an unknown group in an alien setting and running a household in uncertain conditions created by the move can be very stressful both physically and mentally. Given that patriarchy is a project written on women's bodies, Generation 3 too may grow up in an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, till it slowly dissipates as close association with host communities slowly develops over time. So to conclude then, forced displacement is a harsh reality of our iniquitous world and its development paradigm. It would, however, be too simplistic to assume that prior to being displaced, everyone was happily settled and materially comfortable, or that forced resettlement in a new setting invariably leads to a complete destruction of sociality and livelihood. Similarly, providing the basic requirements of shelter and livelihood in a new setting ensures a successful resettlement is a simplistic trope of planners. Though largely neglected in academic studies and by news media, the ability of groups to resist, demand, and negotiate for the restoration of their livelihoods in a new setting is an option that has been utilized in numerous government projects. Forced relocation is an extended process spanning several generations. Not everyone is emotionally or materially settled in the new setting, but over time, and with support from the concerned state bodies and non-governmental organizations, resettlement has been a viable option that has helped displaced people recreate life and sociality in a new setting. Thank you.
So, emplacement. As we already heard from Leela in the first session, the notion of displacement, of course, invites us to meditate on the a priori nature of place and place-making. One way of looking at this is to ask, what do we conceive of as being disarranged in the process of displacement? Even more specific way of asking this question is, what is the object of relief? For what has come to be called the international refugee regime, that is not self-named, but named by the scholars who study it, that developed during the 20th century, it is not place so much as institutions that lie at the core of the order that the IRR proposes to restore. And the international refugee regime here refers to what Bashara had already discussed as this interplay of humanitarianism and state and transnational intervention that has created the world that we live in today, also based on war, as the notion of war, as Fazira pointed out. The, quote, principle of unity of the family as the natural and fundamental group unit of society, unquote, was a key conference addendum to the 1950 United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees and the protocol relation to the status of stateless persons, which is, of course, the linchpin of the IRR. And yet the conference, the convention, and the imagining and definitions of 20th century refugees as a whole hinged on the framework of nations and national belonging or failure to belong. In the language of the convention and the conference, the mechanism that both produced the refugee and that would be charged with maintaining the integrity of the family unit was the nation state. The work of non-governmental organizations was necessary, but ultimately responsibility rested with, quote, governments and intergovernmental bodies to facilitate, encourage, and sustain the efforts of properly qualified organizations. So none of this is news particularly, but it bears articulation and emphasis here as a reminder that the terms of this international regime has set the agenda for our contemporary world. And in this, resettlement, as we just heard, and to a lesser degree, asylum are the avowed goals. This in turn involves the movement of family units or individual refugees among national brokers. Placemaking is not a driving concept of this mechanism. Thus, our conceptions of displacement should take care to distinguish and feature a range of historical experiences of a range of mobile populations with regard to their relationship to place. Within these, we will find concepts linking emplacement to the establishment of moral order, community ethos, and political sovereignty in ways that may at times intersect with the priorities of the family and the nation state, but at other moments historically precede them and also live outside and around them if they are in the same historical time period. So I'm going to offer some preliminary examples of what I mean, taken from my own field, which is modern Chinese history. More than 25 years ago, economic historians of the Qing dynasty revived scholarly attention to the topic of disaster relief, mainly by articulating the complex state mechanisms that were created to maintain and move food supply and control prices in order to preserve social and economic stability during times of scarcity. These operated at their height during the 18th century, and some of you may be familiar with this scholarship because the evaluation of the rise and fall of these mechanisms has propelled one element of the so-called Great Divergence debate on comparative global economic development. Subsequently, scholars have explored the struggles of the central state to respond in kind to the major crises of the 19th century, including the devastating Taiping Rebellion, which killed tens of millions of people, and the notorious North China famine of 1876-79, which killed about a tenth of the population in the area it affected, and perhaps as much of a third of the population of one province alone. Yet if we consider holistically the underlying principles of state aid to the victims of war and disaster in late imperial China, care of material needs formed but only one part of a larger whole of social pacification and good governance. First, the distribution of material aid, food, shelter, clothing, medicine, was predicated on the first instance on returning displaced persons to their original homes. This was a logistical and public safety measure, of course, but it was also one that permitted the government to take part in cosmological reconstruction via local versions of state ritual, the honoring of loyal dead and righteous officials, and recognizing relationships with key local religious institutions. The architects of the post-Taiping reconstruction, for example, described this vision of what it meant to take back the city of Nanjing from the rebels who had made it their capital. Chen Zuolin wrote in 1873 that the process included, quote, summoning back to the city those who had fled, strengthening mutual responsibility groups, reviving schools, encouraging agriculture and sericulture, rewarding the loyal and the righteous, promoting worship at shrines and temples, repairing the city walls, giving relief to the orphaned and the poor, overseeing military preparations, and repairing government buildings. The umbrella term that Chen used for this process was this term here, shanhou, which literally means making good or in the aftermath of something. It's a very crude literal translation, which is usually translated though as reconstruction or relief. As a governmental project, Shanhou became the purview of one of the new centralized bureaus created in the aftermath of the Taiping. So this is in part an extension of state power. In this sense, the 19th century Chinese Shanhou leads directly to the 20th century projects that arise during the age of the international refugee regime. So in 1925, for example, we get a Shanhou conference, a reconstruction conference, which was essentially a peace conference following a period of civil war. But then we also get, in the period immediately at the end of World War II, the term is used as part of the China Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the Shanhou Zhouji Zongshu, which was CINRA, the Chinese equivalent of UNRWA, so the Chinese arm of the international refugee regime. These 20th century state iterations of Shanhou, by this point, had discarded the ritual dimension of the term, just as the government at the time in China, the Republic of China, had attempted to shed the cosmological underpinnings of the dynastic system. Now, if we look at the vernacular use of the term, though, Shanho's vernacular usage also refers to just end-of-life ritual in general. So indeed, this was the major part of the late imperial bureau's work, the post-Taiping Shanho Bureau's work, not only through the building of shrines to martyrs and loyal heroes and the encouraging of orthodox religious worship, but through the proper burial of the dead. Still more important for us to understand is that in late imperial and 20th century China, the state was not the only source of relief for the displaced. Scholars such as Joanna Hanlon Smith have demonstrated that benevolent societies spread during this time period and earlier as a way to, as she put it, give meaning to the money that was coursing through a booming commercial economy. Such groups saw another surge and reconfiguration in coastal China in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Private charities took care of orphans and widows and fed, clothed, and treated the indigent. And they did based so on local networks and local ties. They also buried the dead. The emplacement of the dead in a local network, however, doesn't mean that those were cared for who only remained at home. Among the most efficient and successful charitable groups of this time period was Hong Kong's Donghua Hospital, which in addition to being a medical operation, specialized in the transport and storage of the bones of Chinese migrants who had died in North America en route to their burial in their South China hometowns, to a degree that this is referred to by Elizabeth Sin as the freightization of bodies, of bones across the Pacific. The trans-Pacific, trans-regional Donghua networks were extensive versions of similar networks set up by native place associations throughout China and wherever Chinese diasporic populations were found. Their ultimate goal was to close the circle of the sojourner, the migrant, or the refugee. The goal was re-emplacement in death, if not in life. The historical rupture of the 20th century, then, can in one way be represented by the national boundaries, divisions, and redivisions that interrupted these networks, that stopped the traffic due to the erection of national boundaries. A further change lies in the redefinition of the refugee and relief that extracts emplacement in favor of resettlement, or maybe in favor of strategic secondary displacement is another way of thinking about how states treat refugees, a goal that is subject to the military and economic priorities of the nation state. But I think that we can take Tony's point about this sort of layering of the old and the new as a way forward to look at the continued existence of these charitable networks alongside the growth of the nation state and the international refugee regime. And this is the point with which I'll conclude, which is to note that on the scale of the family, lineage, and the community, displacement is a physical and affective condition that people still seek to treat with emplacement, physical re-emplacement as well as ritual re-emplacement. And this continues in the aftermath of World War II in China. And I'll give you an example, which is illustrated here in this newspaper. In the months immediately following the cessation of hostilities between Japan and China in 1945, an association of natives of the eastern Chinese city of Wuxi, who had been living in the wartime capital in Sichuan, sent 5 flotillas of wooden boats back up the Yangtze River. These boats contained several hundred people. Other than the boatsmen, however, these several hundred were all dead. Sent while military emergency still necessitated clever negotiations and mounds of paperwork and bribes, and while the living displaced had still not made it back home. And the point was to rebury them, and this is actually a newspaper ad for the society that was carrying out these reburials. This took place in a large wave of what I would call moral and religious reconstruction in the post-war. This is one of many such movements to re-emplace the loss that occurred alongside the IRR's expansion into China. The movement to rebury the dead, to build tombs and lineage halls, to restore or found anew religious societies, many of which took the physical and spiritual care of the dead as primary tasks, as well as to rewrite genealogies. All of these constituted claims of morality and also sovereign order alongside those of the nation state. For the actors who were taking part in these groups, these were also acts of good governance. They were carrying on the act of good governance that had been claimed by the earlier regime, the dynastic regime. Even if modern governments, such as those of the Chinese nationalist and communist parties, or that represented by the International Refugee Regime, had cast them aside. Thank you very much.
Floor is open.
It's Rebecca, yeah? I really liked what you said about displacement being a physical and affective experience. You said that we continue, that we continue to treat with emplacement. I just want to say that I was lucky enough to spend the last few years in Germany, and I witnessed the coming of so many refugees, as we all know, and heard a lot about on the news. And what I found very interesting is that the German example is actually different from this. I come from an area of the world where there's a lot of refugees as well, and I think what you've said here applies. But in the case of Germany, probably because of their sort of historical consciousness and what happened to them during the Second World War, there was a very conscious effort to counter this emplacement, this institutional emplacement that you're talking about. So what we witnessed was so many civil society groups, individual initiatives, where they understood that the trauma that these people are coming with. So little networks in neighborhoods, underground stuff going on at the bottom of people's buildings. I mean, amazing activity. And you witnessed it actually just going for a walk out in the street some days. And I just wanted to highlight this. Of course, I mean, we could talk about the reasons why this happened and, what the case of Germany is. And it was quite exceptional. And it really is, in a way, if I understood you correctly, it's an example that actually, it sort of disproves what you're saying sorry if you go.
So this is more about social integration within Germany.
Yeah, it was a conscious effort to deal with the sort of the negative impact of sort of the affective experience of displacement, right? So it was about socially integrating these people who come with trauma, and also about countering the state and the institutions' ways of dealing with them. This is what was quite interesting about it. So, and it was, like I said, en masse, and there was a realization that the state is dealing with it wrong, although it might have had good intentions, so to speak. But it was dealing with it in the wrong way by, for example, placing people in certain areas of the country, according to where they saw fit, or according to where the government saw they needed to go. And this is quite traumatic, actually, for some people who are used to, for example, living in a big city, and suddenly they're put away in a tiny German town, or the other way around as well. Anyway, just a comment. I thought I'd share this.
I actually think
experience.
that's kind of congruent with what I'm trying to say too,
Okay.
which is, I mean, maybe the source is a little bit different, but the idea that either through the, I think it's maybe that the source of the organization is different, and the source of the funding is different in different historical periods. But the idea that there are these non-state organizations which are doing the work of emplacement and settlement is the key.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I have questions, but I'll prefer.
So if I may follow up on that, and just to maybe ask maybe you and Vikram to think together and thinking aloud emplacement and resettlement and the ways in which you're thinking about them and the role of non-state organizations and mobilizations in the process of emplacement and resettlement. If you think of them as conceptually different, and if so, just to elaborate on it.
Wazira, there are two aspects to it. One is the historical aspect of religious bodies. I mean, even before the formal rise of the NGOs, as you know, the late 20th century is particularly a big example of it. One always had voluntary bodies either arising out of, say, post, the colonial struggles in the modern period, and of course for centuries because of religious bodies and monks and things. So the idea of service was always there. It's from there that the idea of non-state intervention to help those who are sick and in need. And in times of famine, in times of sickness and epidemics, that was always there. But in the last 3 decades in particular, I mean, as states have been withdrawing from their role, I mean, there's been a dramatic rise of NGOs world over and of course transnational NGOs as well. And part of it has to do that in the first few decades for post-colonial states and for European countries, the idea of creating special bodies which dealt with planning and implementation of projects, including relocation of people, has now been passed on to, has been delegated or has been, so they have withdrawn from that and they have passed on that responsibility to NGOs, and that's where non-state bodies come into prominence. And finally, there's the aspect, of course, of transnational NGOs, particularly strengthened after the end of Cold War, which can take up advocacy roles across countries and continents, and often bring pressure on the sovereignty of nation states, questioning its abilities.
So I guess one thing I'll say, and I'll confess I'm still thinking through this, is I'm interested in tracing out these longer histories of not just of not only non-state entities that do charity, but also the longer history of the treatment of displaced persons as a central part of the idea of what it means to be a good government. Because the construction of the modern humanitarian regime is that this is essentially a problem of modernity or lack of governance. So we talk about failed states generating refugee situations or generating displacement, and then it's that therefore international refugee regime has to exert itself in response to that, or other times NGOs have to exert themselves in response to that. And to me, the one counter to that is to demonstrate that actually this is not just a modern question, that for a long time that states have taken it as part of the management of populations in extreme as part of their government, their ideas about government, and that this is actually one of the changes in modernity is the throwing off of some of those obligations, which might be more broadly construed as community-based, whether or ritual-based, or I mean, I really don't want to use the word spiritual here, but something more along those lines, moral in terms of moral order, for things that are considered to be like more bare life, bare existence. And yet, on the other hand, non-state actors still do see that larger idea of taking care of displacement and taking care of communities as something inherent, maybe not to national sovereignty, but the sovereignty, the moral sovereignty of the community writ large. So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at with this idea of emplacement.
Clarify something. In this attempt to provide relief after catastrophes of different kinds, natural or war, etc., you can distinguish between caring for the people where they are and helping them to resettle, and helping them to come back. And I thought that you are emphasizing the return element. Now, I wonder, do you think that there is an inherent or a difference of principle here between these two kinds of provision and care for the victims of
I think in the material that I look at, there is a difference in the sense that when I look at at programs for refugee relief in the 20th century state, certainly in China, there's a shift between bringing people back to their homes as a priority and moving them to a place that is convenient to the state or desirable for the state for reasons of economic strategy, of military strategy, of state building strategy, and rendering aid there. And so this is a decisive shift that happens, you can probably, as early as the 1920s, but certainly by the time of World War II. But I don't think it's definitely not restricted to China. We can see this in the Soviet Union, we can see it in Central Europe, we can see it in other places in the world as well. So this idea that's why I use this term, strategic secondary displacement is one way of describing what I think is going on here, which is it's resettlement, but it's a very specific kind of resettlement where the state will say, we want to put refugees on this particular farm, which is far away from their home, and not let them come back home because we want to spur economic production, but we also want to pacify society. And this continues actually as a trend through the 1960s and on.
This is not working. I'd like to invite Vikram to share the human dimension of his research. So your paper, in a way, sketches all the different variables in the kind of a schematic fashion that one must take into account when analyzing the question of resettlement and social movements. But nowhere in the paper is there a sense of the fact that you spent 15 years doing ethnographic kind of work in doing this. I just want to invite you to share a story, and I do it not for entertainment, but because I do believe very strongly that recuperating that human experience is actually essential for us to be able to rethink our analytical categories. So if you can share something with that. The general question for the panel is, China is its own universe to a certain extent. So here is not really a question necessarily of outside the borders of China or within the border, but about really within the borders of China. Or in the case of India, the same thing. So we're talking not about states only or about empires only, but we're talking about subnational and sub-regional spaces as a different kind of spatiality for thinking about displacement. And that opens a door, I think, to thinking about the pre-modern period. Because if the question of state borders and international law that is based on the nations and their sovereignty within these borders, if that becomes less of a filter through which we can think of displacement, and we can think in terms of what's happening inside of specific regions in India or China, for example, and we can do the same thing for the Eastern Mediterranean or wherever else we want to go, Africa, et cetera, then the issue of the before, during, and after, how that is made visible through all kinds of involuntary movements. I'm just wondering if that question makes any sense at all. Oh, it's working now.
Bishar, I'll quickly cover 3 points here. One is that in each of the projects that I did spend time and spoke to people and lived with them, and the others that I visited for short periods, in every single project, when people, and these were all irrigation projects, as in dam to be more specific, or related to that, canals and things. In every single project, the moment when people find that they have they'll be moving out of their villages, which they've lived for at least 7, 8, 10 generations sometimes, or maybe more, but 7 to 10 would be a safe number, I would say. The uncertainty that it creates is, it's in each of the narratives it was very clear. So even when the project is being implemented, they're just hoping in every case that, oh, can't they delay the dam by 1 year, or they close the gates a year after? Because the fear of moving out and moving to a new place is always there, and is always, yeah, it remains. And important, and that was when I realized that how it's so difficult for people like us. I mean, I was born, brought up in India. I think US is a perfect example of people from all over the world coming with skill sets and getting settled here. And compare that to a rural setting where people have only one skill, which is usually around farming and animal husbandry. And to be moving to a new place means, will they be able to grow the same crops? That's the first fear. And the second fear is, will the new community, usually different ethnic groups, will they be accepting them? And so whoever decides to actually take the lead, and then manage to get a few other people, oh, let's give it a shot. The tension within, I mean, you can almost feel it in the air. Oh, X or Y or Z is a turncoat. He has sold us over by, making a deal with the state and moving out. And brothers are out to kill their own brothers. Father and son stop talking to each other for years and years because the son wouldn't accept the resettlement, but the father said it makes sense if they're giving land, and so I'm moving out. And most of these stories came to me secondhand. A few of them I saw it unfold when I was working. And then when they look back at it, they actually laugh at it, the whole thing. I mean, and this is where I would end, with 2 last things. One is, I recall, my PhD was on a very famous anti-dam movement where several documentaries have been made about it. So in my PhD project, when I was doing field work, I actually got a bunch of people to sit together. I got a tractor-operated battery to run my laptop, and I showed them that was the only way, there was no electricity. I showed them the documentary, and I was hoping, my point was that I'll get strong, serious emotional reactions from them. But at that moment when the documentary filmmaker who's from Canada is showing, oh, the police brutally attacked the protesters who were opposing the dam, and 3 or 4 of them said, oh, that's me and that's my cousin, and they started laughing furiously. And I said, well, what's going on? And they said, well, actually, you know what? I and my brother had a serious fight, and we were not on talking terms. But when I saw that my brother was being badly beaten by the police, I felt such strong emotion for him that in the middle of all that canes being moved, I went and hugged him, and we both said, oh, they've beaten you so bad, you're bleeding. And they started holding each other in the middle of all that police action going on, and they're both crying. So that, or in the new setting, they're talking, oh, Vikram, do you remember the tea that you had? See that old cow that died last year? In the documentary, it's the calf that you see, that's the one. So for them, this is the interesting thing I love, that for us, it may be that, oh, what a loss, what a pain. But after the resettlement takes place, and this is long, those fights disappear, they look at the past in a different way. And the idea of pain or trauma is often for the writer. I mean, for the people at the margins of society, life continues and they move on. And even gods move. So when the submergence took place in the hills, and their gods got submerged, and they said we waited for a bad year of rains, the water level in the dam dropped down, we went, retrieved our god, brought it back to the resettlement colony. So now our village is complete because now we've moved the gods. So, yeah.
Say something.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just have a very brief comment. And I think it's fascinating when I hear Rebecca talking about this institutional role, right, in settling, the so-called the effects, whatever the outcome of the consequences of displacement, right? And I'm thinking, and also in relation to Lila's earlier talk, when we think about, I think the question is, to what extent we have considered institutional role in actively making displacement. I'm saying this because currently I'm doing research on socialist China, and during the Cultural Revolution, there is a very interesting, chaotic period, but there is a time like 1968, right? In order to restore the order, and the Chinese government sent the educated youth, Red Guards, right, which was the agent or the major participants of the Cultural Revolution, to countryside. And this kind of government-initiated, we call send down youth movement, or up to the mountain, down to the village movement. It occurred earlier, especially for the group of intellectual, right? So I'm just thinking, in relation to this institutional role. When we think about displacement, or the idea of the fugitive, right, mostly in an active way, how do we think about a positive, right, the institution initiated and the political intentional, the displacement of particular group, right, as they say, cultural movement, right? So, this is just a very brief comment. I think it's just fascinating to think another way of, within the system, the institution play a very important role consciously, right? And also constantly, if you think about, the socialist China period, constantly replacing or displacing certain group, right? And send them to different places. Of course, mostly temporary. By that time, people don't know. This is just a very brief comment. One is the institutional role, and then the other one is whether we can think about, rather than just negative, but positive way of forging this fugitive within the system. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, well, I know the question wasn't addressed to me, but for the period I work on, so for the first millennium, for example, the participation of the institution in forced migration comes up in the Corvée, in settlement post-famine, in a sort of set of ways that we've talked about already, and including, vis-a-vis my talk, a fine on unwed women. Examples in which people were forced to certain practices that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as being displacement, but nevertheless displaced large numbers of people. I guess the question that Bishara asked about sub-regional issues, I guess, again, for my period, the two main axes are north-south and then sort of center and west. So the north-south, the sort of migrations to the south are sort of fundamental to the way you'd see the sort of the internal, where there's China's relationship with Central Asia is sort of the most porous border, even though it was regulated at various points, but it's in terms of language and cultures, nomadic, semi-pastoral nomadic peoples, and the sort of regular displacement and sets of invasions over the first millennium led to a particular place, often called the Northwest or the Western regions, that was a site of constant displacement, which is different, I think, from the history of China per se, that overlapped at different times when China actually encompassed that space and that didn't. So that by taking displacement as your subject, it actually makes the history of China look a little bit different. So it's useful that way. That's a good question, thanks.
So one of the things I've been thinking about in this discussion of nation states and institutions and sovereignty is this idea of human control over these displacements and emplacements and resettlements of populations. And it really made me think about sort of the very spatial elements in kind of the literal sense of the land and the geography within the context of climate change, and how that's beginning to manifest itself in ways that governments and institutions really can't control. And I know that we've taken into account the built environment and the way development projects have sort of changed these populations, but I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about historical, current, or imminent where uncontrollable changes in the geography are going to be managed.
I can just say something very briefly. I'm sure you have better, I'm sure you have a, Vikram can answer this properly. But just in terms of historiography, I work generally on the Silk Road, and it was the sort of drying up of the Tarim Basin in the 3rd, 4th century that sort of ended the Silk Road during a certain period and ended up in, led to a lot of displacement. And within sort of the history of the environment is a lot of the sort of 19th century development of ecological thinking or climate thought that sort of preceded current discourses about the climate by about a century, looked at these at issues around desertification. And so a lot of the theories about sort of human migration, in particular around the Silk Road, was centered around this issue of climate change and human migration in the Silk Road. So.
I think one of the ways the question can be seen is the regional variances if we take the whole world as one unit. I mean, so when we read about, say, Agamben's police state, and this was a conversation Bishara and I were having yesterday, I marvel because the projects I have worked in, that I've studied and I've written about, we're talking of hundreds of families comprising thousands of people who are saying, oh, we are affected by the project. The state doesn't recognize us as project affected. So, in effect, people are wanting to be counted by the state. The state says, no, you don't even exist, okay? And this is the exact opposite of the police state that, say, Giorgio Agamben or Foucault is talking about, the surveillance and second, the state neither has that kind of the energy, the resources or the reach, and I'm talking of most parts of Asia. And if you leave certain big industrial towns, special economic zones and urban centers, state doesn't have the kind of reach or the ability to actually control population in large parts of Asia. I would say almost all of Asia, and so that's one thing. The second thing is the break between where people in Asia or I would say even Africa or Latin America are placed in contrast to, say, Europe or North America. I mean, the global North and the global South. In global South, it's all based on fossil fuels, that some amount of basic material security in terms of food 2 times a day, assured clothing, has actually reached a lot of people only now. So modernity has just actually started showing rewards for them. The irony is just when it starts percolating down and they're seeing the dreams that, oh, maybe next generation things will get even better. And it will not, of course, we know it. But they still have the dream. Just then, something happens and they find out, no, it's actually bad to use fossil fuels. We are facing a global warming. You should cut down on this. So it's the discord between, and so they're always one step behind in the game. I think, to quote one of my informants in the hill area, he said, he's from the hills, they were relocated to the plains. He said, we were always one step behind in the game. When education came, we were still running around with bows and arrows in the forest. By the time we discovered schools, people had moved to colleges. By the time we discovered colleges, government jobs had disappeared. And so there are no jobs, we educate. So we're always one step behind in the game. I think in a lot of ways, this is the story of Global South as compared to, In global warming, we'll see a similar situation. And the problem with that is to create a consensus then at the level, not at policy levels, but actually to involve people and make them agree to certain steps.
I can improve on that.
Yes, I was triggered by the idea of displacement as both leaving the home and coming back. And as Professor Opia was talking about, so the idea, the environmental and social affective construction of the idea of home and for the refugee and people who leave and then will come back. But I feel like sometimes effectively the displacement happens not only in geography, it's also happened in time, considering the intergenerational thing that Vikram was talking about. So one example I was thinking is related to Tamara's story, those inter-ethnic marriage as to bring some woman out of China to Central Asia. But when they kind of settle down and give birth to the offsprings there and get accustomed to the diet and the environmental and the living habit, they had hard time to come back as the literary source represents. So they are caught up in the kind of dilemma of displacement. So the home, when they return, it also changed because of the war and then devastating effects. So there's no home to come back. So it is like the redisplacement, like the displacement of displacement happening in time, both effectively and on different levels. And the states, maybe modern states in contrast to pre-modern states, are taking a very active role in constructing the home and the new homes. Like I was too last year, and I was seeing all those states' active participation in the making of the image of spectacle of welcoming organizations and things I was thinking. But also there are talks, discourse about the demand in Germany of affordable labors. And then since the Second World War, there are constant demand in that area of the world because Germany is very depopulated. And I was just thinking, this complex, sophisticated levels around the displacement.
Oh, well,
You want to
yeah.
respond?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You want to respond?
To Kaijun. I understand that was more of a comment, and I appreciate that. I'll think more on that. Thanks, Kaijun.
I've got a couple responses saved up, but if you want to go
Sorry.
ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I think we should ask and then.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
We're getting close to the end.
Okay.
A question for the three of you, and potentially for our previous speakers, is about a form of displacement that we haven't talked about up until now, which I'm trying to put a name to. It might be called sort of historiography in the service of displacement. The histories that are told in order to remove people from places where they're allowed to live, whether that be histories about national parkland and Native Americans who are described as being relative newcomers and therefore displaceable, Palestinian residents of the West Bank. Is this a kind of displacement that you've seen in your own work? And if so, where, and where does it fit into the discussion?
Should we just go down the line? Maybe. So this is good because this allows me to make my response back to Ling Jun's comment, which is going to be a kind of self-critique, which is a good time-honored Communist Party tradition. So I will do that, which is to say, the things that are left out of the emphasis on emplacement is, of course, the emphasis on these institutions. These are all themselves institutions of power. I'm talking lineage, structure, family, these charitable groups. They all exercise power themselves, and the process, to talk about the process of coming home and being displaced in time, that is also a process that is being enacted as these tombs are built. The rebuilding of tombs of course, it's a well-known strategy for claiming land in times of social and economic disorder, post-war, post-famine, as well as burying your loved ones, as well as making a kind, sort of settling the cosmological order. So you can do all those things at once, and it's hard to say one is more important than the other, but it's also a way of making that historiographic erasure. And similarly, you claim land and you are able to house your family and friends who have been away during wartime and come back to find someone living in their house, or the house is bombed, or something. So this is a long, not unique to this situation as well, that there are all these very, very complex negotiations that have to go on in a time of post-war and continuing war. So that I don't want to sort of hide that, but I think that it's both and, that there's both these processes go on at the same time as well. So I would make that point.
I covered in my paper, the whole point is that usually, most often than not, the people who get displaced by projects are the ones who are the weakest at the margins of society, have the least amount of bargaining power, and will not be able to. In fact, to give you a statistical figure, I mean, in India, 40% of the people displaced by industrial projects are from groups scheduled tribe and scheduled castes. Scheduled castes are the former untouchable castes, scheduled tribes, of course, living in hills and plains. And their actual percentage in population is only 8% each, respectively. So that just shows who suffers most, and because the ones with the weakest voices. Yeah.
If I may just respond quickly, you said the first panel as well. If I may, because respond to your question about historiography, because you also directed it to the first panel as well. I think that it may be useful to think about not history of, kind of displacement, historiography and displacement, but it may be useful to think about epistemic erasure. Epistemic erasure. In other words, that an order of knowledge is actually created, and within those orders of knowledge, what you may call displacement is something is actually left out, but deliberately left out, and then the order of knowledge becomes normalized and naturalized. And then when we begin to think about those orders of knowledge, we do it without thinking about what's been left out, or what Foucault would call, subjugated knowledges. And I think that that is the way I like to sit, because then what that then does is that then constructs a certain episteme in what is the horizon of one's thought. So what you can think, what's the horizon from which you must think and from which you cannot go beyond in an epistemic way. So I like to think about it as epistemic erasure. and then the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, which then troubles that and broadens the field and changes the epistemic ways in which we might want to look at a certain order of knowledge.
Thank you very much. So I've been tasked with, I don't know what the proper word is, but I'll just call it some remarks on the workshop today. By definition, there'll be a bit rambling, but I'll do my best. Let me begin with a confession. The confession is that displacement is not a field of knowledge that I participate in, or this is not my project. But I've always thought it was very important because I also think of myself, in fact, I primarily think of myself as an activist rather than academic. So the question here for me is not, well, the question here for me is how do political practices can gain efficacy in terms of getting results through a process of reimagining the very concepts and terms that we deal with. So to the extent that this reimagining can lead to or interfaces with actual practices is the part that I'm really interested in. And in that sense, I would like to make the following remarks. First of all, judging from the discussions, the question of the human and the question of the social contract got a lot of play. And I think there's a reason for that. And because the first asks that we not be blinded by the fact that many people, when they say we want to be treated as human or we want to be, recognized by the state, they're appropriating the terminology that victimized them in the first place. So that in and of itself is not a vehicle for expanding our intellectual horizons necessarily. At the same time, what that militates that we do is to ask exactly as Tony asked, why are they saying that and how are they saying it and what do they mean by it? And this means two things. One is a responsibility on our part to excavate the contested meanings of the human and not just accept those meanings that were established or made hegemonic by the triumphs of capitalism, the nation state, and a kind of a global imperial domination. That is to say, we're looking for those contested meanings of resistance that were buried or marginalized over time, and that requires a great deal of excavation. But even if we do that, we are still in many ways within the same universe of Western liberal humanism. And so our second task possibly could be how to get out of that black box, because if there is such a major change that takes place with modernity, it becomes almost impossible to rethink this conceptual category using the very language that was created out of an imperial or a colonial experience. So here may be a possibility of rethinking about the human by taking seriously the project that we're trying to do here, which is to push the envelope temporally and back in time. Not just before the 20th century, though that is very important and basically dominates much of the discussion, back to the 15th, but also even before the 15th century. And to take the ways of thinking that attended recognizably similar phenomena in South Asia and China and elsewhere before the 15th century. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. The second, about the social contract, obviously is also of great interest to everyone here, because it basically asks us to reimagine what we consider to be the political order and the forms of association between human beings. And here, how can we think of such an order that embodies within it, or makes possible within it, a very wide range of movements and flights and abstentions as well? If we think of the modern nation state and the social contract it embodies as one of fixing, how can we think of social contracts in ways that unfix as easily as they fix, and yet maintain a way for us to have a kind of a commons, so to speak? And here the questions of dignity and hospitality really stuck with me. And if I may, just for about 45 seconds, go on a tangent about hospitality. Dignity is clearly the word of the decade, because that was the word of the uprisings in the Arab world and the tragedies that they led to. It's the word of the refugees crossing the Mediterranean or the Balkans, et cetera, et cetera. But hospitality is, I think, Hanan, in a way, requires not just empathy, it requires almost having suffered through the same trauma and being able to think through that. But hospitality is a two-edged sword. After all, we have Thanksgiving coming up, and we saw what the hospitality of the native population led to in terms of allowing these colonies to survive in the first place. And I'm thinking also of the fact that the first Zionist settlement of Petah Tikva in Palestine in 1878, I think it was, the memoirs of the people who started the settlement are filled with references to we could not have survived because we did not know the land, we did not know how to do the crops, we did not know so many things, and we learned, they came to us and they helped us with that. And if Arij was here, her dissertation is about the hospitality of the Arab villages to the Zionist settlements in the 1930s in the northern part of Palestine, and the question of receiving and how that was used in many ways to actually enable conquest. So we have to be very careful, I think, in trying to think, what kind of hospitality do we mean? That's all I want. That's my 45-second tangent. I was really struck by how strong the word family came in, especially for this panel. Now, I do write on family history, so now I feel on firmer grounds. The question of the life cycle as one of displacement, right? Getting married, but not just getting married, having children, not just having children, but somebody dying, not just somebody dying, but your in-laws coming in, and the pecking order inside the house changes, etc. You're displacing people's social position, political power, et cetera, et cetera. And it happens on a regular basis that becomes ritualized and then normatized through not just law, but also local practices, et cetera, et cetera. That is really a rich metaphor for thinking about displacement writ large. The question of the family, the marriage, generations, children, et cetera. And I would really be happy if we try to pursue the possibilities of that in terms of what are implications in terms of political theory. The question of scale, for example, takes on a completely different meaning if you think of billions of marriages that accrue over time and generate a whole literature and poetry or in political language, et cetera. Vikram talked a lot about family as well. How can we imagine these social movements actually taking place without understanding how the discussions within the family and between families and so on and so forth. I do have a lot of notes here of things I wanted to say, but I think I've gone long enough except to make another confession, sort of the other bookend. Why did I get interested in this project in the first place? I mentioned before, because of activism and possibilities that rethinking our world and our language through the exercise of talking about displacement has a special resonance for the Palestinians, and that's something that I write about, actually. So the Palestinians in the 20th century represent perhaps the oldest refugee population that's recognized as a refugee population and continues. But they were displaced by the displaced to a certain extent, and that complicates issues a great deal. And not only were they displaced by the displaced, but they were also displaced in the name of nationhood, peoplehood, progress, and human rights. So, well, the Holy Land we'll put aside for now. So, in a way that makes their fight for freedom and justice impossible if it's only going to go according to the rules of the game that were established by nations, progress, etc. So this is a real problem, political problem for me. And I was talking to Tony, and I think we may agree on this. I don't know, but on the one hand, it's okay for Western-educated professionals with cushy jobs in Brown University and elsewhere to sit and talk, and how can we reimagine and get rid of the nation state and build this commons and do all that kind of stuff. But when you go on the ground, people say, I want a state. I want the police, I want a job, I want electricity, I want the water to run, I want to have a passport, I want all these things that you're saying are the causes of my misery. And so how, and even if it's impossible for them to win in playing by these rules of the game, and I believe it is, but this is what on the ground they want, then how do you deal with this issue? How do you find the language to try to change the rules of the game while at the same time leading to some results that are recognizable as actually wanted results? I mean, people that actually want these things. So this is an especially important question for the Palestinians now, because if this was 200 years ago and the nation state is just beginning and is following a program of enfranchisement and bringing more people into the political fold and playing the game of democracy or social welfare, et cetera, that's fine. But this is coming at a time when the nation state as a form of political order is, let's say, suffering, and in some places imploding. And in all cases, facing a kind of a horizon of climate change that makes all this kind of less important than it seems. So I see here the question of displacement keeps pushing us to think of a new way of associating through a social contract that is somehow different from and yet can be transitioned into. And that is the difficult part for me. Having said all that, I think there is something to be admitted about the 20th century, even though as a historian in many ways who is very skeptical of ruptures. I must admit, this is the century not only that the juridical human has flattened out in the sense that slavery, corvée labor, indentured servitude, et cetera, are formally categories anymore. But it's also the first time since the beginning, whatever the beginning was, that more people live in cities than they do in the countryside. And that is kind of a huge change in terms of how people imagine their social contract with each other. And for these two reasons, not to mention the fact that military technologies and surveillance technologies are making it possible now to reverse everything, so that the question now is not moving slaves from Africa, it's not about moving populations from here to there, it's actually about locking them in place and then bringing over certain technologies that would make them productive labor for this or that motive. That has become now a distinct possibility. And that, I think, would at least causes me to start to rethink displacement, not in terms of just movement, but in terms of forced placement as well. And how does imprisonment and displacement sort of become almost the same thing? Thank you very much for coming. We asked a lot of you because not just some of us at least rambled, but also because it was such a long program. The future workshops will be shorter in duration and more pointed, and they will have people coming in from outside of Brown University to be part of the group. So I hope that you'll be able to make all of them. And please let us know what you think and help us move forward in just spreading this conversation across the campus. Thank you.